The UVA Living Wage campaign since we were students in the ancient times know that it makes a tremendous difference for student activists to know that what they're doing is being heard around the country and around the world, and to be able to hear what's happening in similar campaigns around the rest of the country. And we can't do that without Democracy Now! It is the one most reliable source of this kind of information that's actually useful for a democracy. So without further ado, I'd like to bring up Dennis Moyinhan, and please welcome Dennis to Charlottesville, Virginia.
Thanks very much. Thanks for coming out. And we had hoped to, Amy and I had hoped to come and do some of the reporting as David mentioned, and thank you for that great introduction. And David and Sean McCord, David Swanson, if you don't know him, I think you probably do, but really a tireless anti-war organizer, among other things, and a very effective communicator, and also a great person to help frame a lot of the important issues of the day for media outlets like Democracy Now! How we get information from the grassroots and then get it out to our audiences because of such talented organizers and writers like David Swanson and Sean McCord, who helped arrange this room for us tonight. It's a beautiful space, and we're just glad to be here back in Charlottesville. It's been a while. My colleague Amy Gubin and I are here as part of this 100-city tour that David mentioned, following loosely a trajectory of what are called swing states. I live in Colorado, you're here in Virginia, so you know. Principally to look at how people are organizing around the issues that are important to them. Because of this phenomenal traffic that we were unaware of, David said second only to DC is second only to Los Angeles in traffic. I was really blissfully ignorant of that until a couple hours ago. But the issue of living wage, which is something obviously. David said, organizing here since he was in grad school to try to affect that on the campus, and so central to life in the U.S. post-housing bubble crash, but also just for anyone living below the poverty line, below what the living wage would grant. It's important. Whether there's always an economic crisis for people living at that level. So it's really important, and their stories are important, and that's part of what we cover, or try to cover, as well as we can at Democracy Now! Day in, day out. This book is a collection of columns with an extra piece. The living wage is also very connected to the Occupy movement, right? Social, economic inequality, and people making just insane and really highly immoral sums of money, or making them immorally, while other people are struggling to make the basics, and the ripple effects of the criminality on Wall Street now visible in the streets of Spain and Greece, and here in the U.S. as well. So as we travel on these 100 cities, it's roughly 100. I don't know if it's more or less, but we keep adding cities. People call us up and say, "Why aren't you coming here or there?" And we're like, "Oh, that was my fault." Just like we pack things in too tightly and end up missing important rallies, like the living wage rally that just happened, which we wanted to cover in person and will continue to cover as we do things nationally, remotely. But the issues that are important to people, it's part of the genesis of Democracy Now! In 1996, to look at why is it that so few people actually turn out to vote. In 96, at least the stat was less than half of those eligible to vote were actually doing so. And so what was this lack of engagement, lack of access to the ballot? Things have changed since 96. We used to have one day for elections, a work day, and then if you're lucky, functional voting machines and enough of them. But still, the number of efforts to suppress voter turnout, to suppress access to the polls. So following the swing states, we started with the two major party conventions in Tampa, the Republicans, and Charlotte, the Democratic convention. And then went across Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, with a stop in Chicago. We got into town as the Chicago Teachers Union was announcing their settlement of their strike. That was pretty coincidental and quite momentous time to be there, pretty exciting. We had the Teachers Union President, Karen Lewis, on the program the next morning, and got an update from her. So Wisconsin, and then, and regardless of where you are now at this time of the election season, there are things happening. We ended up swinging through the Twin Cities, where there's a statewide ballot, where currently there is no legal marriage equality in Minnesota, but those who are opposing it, nevertheless, even though it's already not legal, want to make a constitutional amendment. So there's that kind of just trying to make it doubly legal. So there's a lot of activity, and you see signs predominantly against it. And there's a very progressive Secretary of State, Mark Ritchie, in Minnesota, and so he tried to use his power of his office, his elected office, to phrase the marriage, the ban on marriage equality amendment that was proposed by these opponents of marriage equality in a way that's a little more sensible and kind of more rationally phrased, and he did succeed, but then that was overturned. So there's a lot of chicanery with our ballots, a lot of organizing that's happening around this, and so that's what we're doing, trying to get a sense, trying to do a different type of news coverage than you're getting, from the networks, the cable news networks in particular, with the constant fixation on poll numbers on a daily basis, and the daily gaffe watch, see who said what. It may have been somewhat poorly phrased, and really looking at more fundamental issues. Related to the living wage campaign, I was asking David, what is the living wage that's being asked for here? Does anyone know? $13 an hour. So that's, I don't think, if any place that can afford a room like this can afford. And for contract workers, for staff workers, that's another. I've been a contract worker in my past, and I remember once working for a financial firm as a temp for, I think it was a year and a half. I was a temp for a year and a half. Someone at the headquarters said, you get 2 weeks vacation for doing that. Really? Oh, that was quite a perk. So we probably aren't really accustomed as workers in this country anymore to expect these things, but people fighting for these things. So we went between Chicago and Madison, the teachers union on one side, the seat of the Wisconsin uprising on the other. We went through Freeport, Illinois, and Amy can describe that more in detail, but it was really people fighting for about the same wage. If you saw or heard that on Democracy Now! Freeport, Illinois, where some workers have their company, Sensata Technologies, or Honeywell. They worked for Honeywell that was bought by another firm called Sensata, which is owned by Bain Capital. And shortly, within days of being bought by Bain, they were brought into a large room and told their jobs were being sent to China. And so that's kind of the job creation reality that we saw. And Amy and I have a column out this week that I think it's titled, "Romney does have a jobs plan, too bad it's for China." But you'll find again, it's 3 years worth of columns looking at everything from climate change, dirty energy, economic inequality, Occupy Wall Street. We've traveled to a lot of the climate conferences around the world, both the UN conferences, if you follow them, that have been kind of highly corporatized and with the process abuses of the Obama administration kind of derailing them, to the rights for the conference for the rights of Mother Earth in Cochabamba, Bolivia, which was a fascinating gathering, about 20,000 people underneath the dwindling glaciers, part of the water supply of La Paz. Fascinating experience. I've been privileged to work with Amy Goodman and to kind of share that really fast-paced, I'd have to say, in the midst of this 100-city tour, really news gathering odyssey. But it's her work started a quarter century ago. If you know her story, some of it's alluded to in this introduction. A filmmaker who she met in the 80s before his first film came out was kind enough to write a foreword to this book. I'll just share a bit of it with you. His name is Michael Moore, and as he writes, let me just read this. I first met Amy Goodman in the first month of the first Palestinian Intifada. It's where I usually go to meet people. You throw an intifada, I'm there, and so is Amy. In fact, if you're in the middle of any sort of rebellion, revolution, uprising, or you're just getting the familiar, everyday ass-whooping by forces that seem much greater than yours, that is where you'll find the fearless Amy Goodman. It's safe to say that she lives by the promise Tom Joad made to his mother at the end of Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath. I'll be everywhere. Wherever there's a fight so hungry people can eat, I'll be there. Wherever there's a cop beating up a guy, I'll be there. If there's one thing you can trust, it's that Amy Goodman will always be there. The weeks we spent together in the West Bank and Gaza were, to say the least, quite harrowing, and yet they had a profound impact on both of us. It was just after Christmas 1987, and the Palestinian people had decided to rise up and resist their Israeli minders with protests, civil disobedience, and stones. Stones. Ah, remember the days of stones? Such an innocent time it was back then. Ralph Nader had asked a group of us, mostly writers and journalists, to go over to the occupied territories and bring back to the American public the truth about what was really going on. Little did we know that we would be witnessing the first weeks of what, sadly, is now a 25-year-long resistance. Here's the dominant image in my head of Amy Goodman during that month in Palestine. When the Israeli soldiers started firing their rubber bullets at us and a group of unarmed Palestinians, we would all run the other way, i.e. away from the bullets. And Amy Goodman would be running the opposite way, straight into the melee. She appeared as if she were invincible, and while I do not want to imply she's some sort of superhero with supernatural powers, I will say I'm glad she's on our side, and leave it at that. 2 years later, in 1990, Amy Goodman and fellow journalist Alan Nairn traveled to East Timor to cover their independence movement, and it was there that she personally witnessed the murder and massacre of 270 Timorese civilians by the Indonesian army. And for bearing witness to this horrific event, she and Alan were beaten by the army officials. I cannot imagine what it would be like to be present while 270 people are being killed. But there was Amy again, on the front lines, searching out the truth and at great personal risk. Amy is a serious journalist who has won many of the nation's top journalism honors, including the George Polk Award, the Alfred I. DuPont Columbia University Award, and the Robert F. Kennedy Journalism Award, among others. Amy's daily television and radio show, Democracy Now!, is currently in its 16th year. How on earth she and her remarkable team pull this together day after day is beyond me. When I did a weekly TV show, I wanted to throw myself into the East River at the end of every week. I have been on her show many times, and I have seen backstage the incredible professional operation they have over there in downtown Manhattan. I don't know if they get tours like they do at NBC, but I would put the Democracy Now! Headquarters on any intelligent tourist's must-see list. And I do want to say, interrupt here, that we do give tours. The new studios, it's the greenest TV, radio, internet studio in the country. It got LEED Platinum certification from the U.S. Green Building Council. And it is, and people are welcome to see it. This book contains many of Amy's commentaries and columns over the past years. It is fascinating reading, a true chronicle of our times, and a real head shaker as you read it and wonder, how is it we're still here? Back in early 1988, as we traveled the back roads of the West Bank, going from one village to another, there was much that we saw that could make even the most committed among us give up hope, beset with the knowledge that true justice seemed like a faraway destination. After all, this was a struggle between a massive military machine that had nuclear weapons and children with slingshots. Who wins that fight? Well, there was a day, a long, long time ago, that an oppressed people had a young boy with a slingshot, and that boy used that slingshot, and for that, his people would be free. So we didn't leave Palestine in total despair. In fact, we were deeply inspired by the will and determination of the people we met, people who had nothing, people who were in it for the long haul, and had no intention of giving up. It was a good lesson for us to learn. It would be another 2 years before I would release my first film, Roger and Me, and it would be 8 more years before Democracy Now! Would go on the air. We became committed to doing our best with the slingshots we had. And that's the foreword by Michael Moore. Just as a note, we have these DVDs of Michael Moore's recent appearance on Democracy Now! Talking about his life, and it's free tonight as a thank you gift if you buy 2 books from your UVA bookstore back there. It helps, you know, as I said, David does do great work getting progressive ideas out to the press through his writing, but the metrics that are associated with books, books are judged not by their covers in our society, but how many people buy them, and so it helps. I've done a lot of these tours before, and the books have always appeared on various bestseller lists, but it was really, when I worked with, everyone know the Democracy Now! Co-host Juan Gonzalez. Juan's a great writer, great organizer, great journalist, and he asked me to help out with this book that was coming out last fall, which I highly recommend, called News for All the People, the epic story of race in the American media. It's really incredible. It also has a lot of important references to the South and the struggle, the use of newspapers in the furthering of, or the creation of Jim Crow, and the fanning the flames of violence, and how people, despite that, use the press to fight for civil rights and justice. It's a great book, but we did a whirlwind tour, which was only about a week and a half. And I don't know if Juan will ever forgive me, but we were all over the place, and these are giant hardcovers, slinging them around, hauling them from event to event. But when they did appear on the New York Times bestseller list, it was just below Harry Belafonte's memoir, and it nudged Dick Cheney's down one slot. So it was good. So with that, I just want to thank you again for all coming out. I want to thank Nathan Moore from WTJU. He's doing true to his email moniker, the Tall Nathan. You can definitely pick him out of a crowd, even if he's sitting. And it's a difficult job. Doing public radio is tough. I was actually part of a very small meeting in 2001. Free Speech Radio News is another show carried on WTJU. It used to be just a weekly show, weekly half hour. And Juan and I and a couple other people got together and were thinking, what do we need to do to make this a show every weekday? Because we knew there was a need for it. And so back then, very small crew at FSRN decided that they were up to the workload of doing a weekly show. So we rustled up enough startup funds to give them about 3 to 4 months of money to do it. And sure enough, with that hard work and the seed money that we were able to come up with, Free Speech Radio News has been going since, for now in its second decade. Certainly not without struggle, its journalists taking some of the most extraordinary risks of any in the field. So they're to be commended. Nathan has long been a part of both directly and as a supporter of Free Speech Radio News. So thank you, Nathan. On that issue, before I hand it over, it's so important to cover the issues of war, peace, economic justice from the grassroots, from perspectives that are just ignored on a wholesale basis by the corporate media. And I was reminded of that when during what was called propagandistically shock and awe in March of 2003. This was the term the Pentagon adopted, in which the corporate media embraced and spent great resources building animated graphics, if you recall, during the initial bombing of Iraq. A station that carries Democracy Now! In Australia, there's a great little network of community stations there, about 150 of them, and one of them in Sydney called Radio Skid Row sent us an email that a listener of theirs had sent in, which kind of sums up, you know, what I think is so important about doing non-commercial broadcasting, really relying on the audience for support and not corporate advertisers. And the comment was, how is it that the poorest station in Sydney is providing the best coverage of the invasion? And you know, I think he kind of, that listener captured it well, and it's because we don't glory in scant resources, but as Michael Moore said, we commit to do the best we can with what we have. So I learned a lot of lessons in that regard from this dear friend and colleague, Amy Goodman.